What's up and welcome to another episode of Gizmo Slip Tech. Today we're looking at the most powerful gaming laptop that I have ever tested, at least for the majority of games. It is an RTX 2080 full non-max Q in this obviously thick, insanely thick laptop. This is the Asus G703GX. Now we're going to take a deep dive into what makes this the theoretically most powerful gaming laptop I've tested. It just depends on the game actually though, because some of these games, especially some of these really popular games like Fortnite and PUBG, are CPU bound, and this does not have the most powerful processor in a gaming laptop. So in some games this is actually not the fastest laptop in the world, but in other games totally is. So we'll get into that in the benchmarks. We'll get into all the reasons why I really love this laptop and also why I probably ultimately wouldn't buy one for myself, but you actually might if you're looking at a high performance gaming laptop. Without further ado, let's go ahead and break down this laptop's specs. Now you can get this laptop configured with an i7-8750H or an i9-8950HK, but you do need to get the RTX 2080. So the 8750H model starts at $2969, where the i9-8950HK model starts at $3499. So this model starts at $3499 and was configured up from there by HID Evolution. Now this is a laptop model that came directly from them. That means the GPU and CPU have been repasted with Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut, as well as thermal pads on certain key devices if they need them. Now this particular model has the i9-8950HK, as I mentioned before, the RTX 2080, 16 gigs of 2666 Hz memory, a 512 gig SSD Intel 760p with two M.2 PCIe slots available, as well as one 2.5-inch HDD slot available for upgrades. And then for wireless, it comes with the Intel Wireless 9560. Now this thing is very heavy at 10.5 pounds, and the bigger additive weight here is that it requires 2 power bricks. Now these are the 280 watt power bricks that are required to run this machine, and that adds a lot of travel weight if you're needing to game on the go or go to a LAN party with it. It is possible to game with one of these power bricks. I was able to play Far Cry 5 for a few minutes and I drained 3% of the battery. I got about 80% of the frames per second while playing on just one power brick. So if you want to be able to utilize the full performance of this laptop as well as play for a long period of time, you'll need both power bricks. Let's go ahead and take a look at the ports on this bad boy. On the left side, we have our headphone and mic jack, a USB 3 Type A, and a USB-C/Thunderbolt 3, as well as the LAN port and left side exhaust. Now, these exhausts are massive. On the back, we have 2 more massive exhaust ports, HDMI port, a mini display port, and the 2 power ports for both of the plugins. On the right side, we have the full-size SD card slot and 2 more USB 3 Type A's and another massive exhaust port. Overall, this has a really good port selection. I just wish it had one more USB Type A port on it, because you might run out of USB ports, especially if you got a lot. I guess you could always get a USB hub if you need to. Now, as far as the design of this laptop goes, at 2 inches thick at the thickest point and at 10.5 pounds, this thing is as beefy and as tanky as laptops come. We're really, really close to it. There's a couple that are a little bit bigger, but this is a very, very large machine with a very large bezel, a very large footprint, and is very thick. You'll need a specially large backpack to haul this laptop around. Now, as far as the build quality and design of the materials, it's really, really nice. It's got a very nice texture here, as well as a brushed metal feel on this left side and the back of the chassis. It's a very premium laptop, as you would expect at $3,500 starting price, or $3,000 depending on which processor you get. Now I went ahead and benchmarked the crap out of this laptop. I've got a ton of graphs here. Let's go ahead and go over them now. So this first graph is the gaming performance. These are the 4 games we tested. We tested Fortnite, of course, in a playground setting, so there was no variability with frame rates. We tested PUBG in the same city that we test every time, the city of Yasna, running from point A to point B. In Far Cry 5, we used the benchmark to measure the performance. And in The Witcher 3, we have one city that we run from point A to point B and record the average frame rate. Taking a look at the actual numbers here, Fortnite averaged 273, which is ridiculously good. Now this is a mixture of low and ultra. On epic settings in Tilted Towers, it managed to average 140 FPS, and that's in Tilted Towers. That's like the lowest possible FPS that you normally expect. So that's really, really, really good. All 4 of these games are very hard to get over 100 FPS at consistently, and this is a laptop that will deliver more than 100 FPS on average, like all the time. You'll rarely dip below 100 FPS. But how does this laptop stack up to the competition? I've got 3 laptops to compare with. The first laptop we're comparing with is the Eurocom Sky X4C. It has a GTX 1080 and an i9 9900K desktop processor. It weighs a little bit under 8 pounds and is about 1.8 inches thick. So this is another thick and beefy, but it's only a 15-inch chassis, so it's not going to quite be able to cool as well as a 17-inch chassis like this one would. And then we have the Aorus X7 with a full GTX 1080 once again, but with a mobile processor, the i7-8850H. Now the nice thing about the Aorus is that it's only 0.9 inches thick and only weighs 7 pounds, so it's a very thin and light 17-inch gaming laptop. And then we have the Asus GL504 Strix Scar 2, and this one has the GTX 1070 with the i7-8750H, and this is about 1 inch thick. It's a 15-inch laptop and only weighs 5.3 pounds. Let's go ahead and see how these laptops handle some games as well as some synthetic benchmarks. So taking a look at PUBG, you can see that the Eurocom Sky X4C actually takes the lead with 138 FPS, and this is primarily because of the 9900K processor in the Eurocom Sky X4C. This particular benchmark in PUBG is going to be very CPU bound. The main surprise here is that the Aorus X7 actually beat the ROG G703GX in this test. I would have thought that the G703 would have passed the Aorus. Maybe if we were to overclock the processor to like 4.6 gigahertz and test again, I would think the ROG G703 would beat the Aorus. And of course, the GL504S is the lowest of the pack because not only does it have a 1070 graphics card, it's also got a slower processor with the 8750H. Moving on to Far Cry 5's benchmark on all max settings on Ultra, you can see that the Asus ROG G703 absolutely crushes all other laptops here, and that's because Far Cry 5 is primarily bottlenecked by the GPU as long as you have a sufficiently fast processor to pair with it. At 115 FPS, this is the highest, fastest benchmark that I've ever seen in the Far Cry 5 Ultra benchmark for a laptop, so big thumbs up for the ROG G703 on this one. The big surprise here, I think, is the Asus GL504 putting up 90 FPS. That's extremely surprising, extremely good. Only about 10% behind the Eurocom Sky X4C and the Aorus X7, and only about 26% behind the ROG 703. And at a much cheaper price, that is an incredible bang for the buck. Moving on to The Witcher 3, we've got excellent frame rates from the Asus ROG G703 this time, putting up 116 FPS, really widens the gap between this and the next highest Aorus X7 at 92 FPS. This goes to show you that The Witcher 3 is primarily a GPU-bound game where the RTX 2080 can really dominate. I'm kind of blown away that there's this big of a gap actually between the RTX 2080 and the GTX 1080 laptops. We're talking about a 26 FPS gap between the GTX 1080 and an RTX 2080. That's a fairly sizable number, especially for a game like Witcher 3 that is very difficult to get high frame rates on. Now for Fortnite, we're talking about 1080p resolution on a mixture of low and high, and the goal here is to maintain as high a frame rate as possible, and a good example of this utilization would be for a high frame rate 240 Hz monitor. Which of these laptops could hit 240 frames per second as often as possible? Let's take a look. So we've got the ROG G703 coming in at 273, which is actually 2 frames per second less than the Aorus X7. That's kind of interesting, also kind of weird. I would have thought that it would beat it because it does have the i9-8950HK. Again, this is not with the i9-8950HK overclocked. If it was, it probably would beat it almost for sure, probably getting closer to 300 FPS, I would think. Then you have the Eurocom Sky X4C just dominating at 326, and this is because of that i9-9900K processor really pushing out those frame rates. Now, when you have a very high performance GPU, this becomes a very CPU bound game, and that's why we're seeing much better performance in the Eurocom Sky X4C with the 9900K. Now, the main reason why I was so interested in getting 240 frames per second is that I use a 240 frames per second monitor to primarily game on, and when I'm playing Fortnite, I want to hit that frames per second as often as possible, and I was also streaming, so when you stream, you got to knock a good chunk of the frame rates off of these benchmarks here. I might actually do some benchmarks with streaming in the future, but for now, we'll just keep it to these. Basically, a 9900K processor is very important if you want to be able to render and play the game at 240 FPS on a mixture of low and epic settings like we have here. Moving on to 3D Firestrike Ultra, we've got a massive score of 5950 on the G703GX, which again is the highest laptop performance I've ever seen on Firestrike Ultra. So this puts the RTX 2080 about 15% ahead of a GTX 1080, at least at 4K resolution. Now taking a look at the Cinebench R15 multi-score at the highest first run, we managed to get 1370, which is very respectable and a very good overall score. But once the short power limit is up, you are running on the long power limit throttling, which limits the processor to only about 50 watts of usage, which is just not enough wattage to be able to run 6 cores at the stock clock speed. Now the bottom two graphs is when I managed to overclock the processor by undervolting the CPU, increasing the power limit, and then upping the clock speed to 4.6 gigahertz. And I gotta say, it was insanely overclockable. Like, I overclocked this thing, and it was only averaging temps of about 72 degrees in Cinebench benchmarks in a loop, which is insanely low, and it was only pulling about 90 watts when rendering Adobe Premiere Pro, which we're going to go ahead and talk about that in a second. But first, look at these Cinebench scores. 1487, that is very good for an 8950 HK. It is, I think, possible to overclock this thing further because, like I said, I was only getting about 72 degrees on average in Cinebench R15 at 4.6 gigahertz. You could definitely take this a little bit further. I'm not sure if the VRM could actually handle that much power throughput or not. You're probably reaching the limit around 4.6 or 4.7 gigahertz in my opinion. We'll have to see. I'm not going to try to overclock this like 5 gigahertz plus or anything, but it actually might be possible to at least get 4.8, at least if you're getting it from HID Evolution with upgraded repasting with Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. So how does this Cinebench score compare to the 4 laptops that we're comparing with here? So we've got the G703 at 1487 and the Eurocom Sky X4C at 1875. Now these are the best CPU settings that I was able to maintain. They all have undervolts on all of the CPUs here, and if it's overclockable, I have overclocked it to the highest stable setting that I was willing to test with. So with the G703, we're looking at 4.6 gigahertz. The Sky X4C, I believe we were actually only hitting about 4.3 gigahertz or 4.4 gigahertz or so, and we were managing to hit that 1875 really consistently. Then on the Aorus X7, we're at 4.3 gigahertz with a hefty 0.65 millivolt undervolt, and it's able to average 1400, which is really, really good. And the GL504S had a 100 millivolt undervolt and managed to average 1219, which again is a really good score for an 8750H processor. So all 4 of these laptops have really strong processors, and depending on the size of the laptop that you're willing to carry, you can see there's a drastic difference in performance of the CPU. And last but not least, we have the Adobe 4K render times. We've got the G703GX coming in at 7 minutes and 28 seconds. The Eurocom Sky X4C coming in at an incredibly fast 5 minutes and 46 seconds. That's a very good render time for this test. And then we got the Aorus X7 coming in at the 8 minutes and 19 seconds. And again, this is with the best CPU settings that I could get on these laptops. If you were to overclock this some more, you might actually get it to go down to about the 7-minute mark or maybe 6:30 mark if you overclock this to about 4.8 gigahertz. Now, as far as overclocking this to 4.6 gigahertz and rendering with Adobe Premiere Pro, this thing averaged only 74 degrees during the render time, which is insanely good, especially since the processor was pulling 95 watts of power on a consistent throughput. Overall, I was really impressed with this laptop's performance. Its temps stayed very low overall, only hitting about 80 degrees when you're at full stock settings. Now that's in Far Cry 5 doing like an extended gaming session. Those are exceptionally good temperatures, especially considering this is Far Cry 5, which pushes both your CPU and your GPU. Most laptops that I test end up throttling at least a little bit with the CPU, especially in Far Cry 5, but we never saw any throttling in Far Cry 5 with this laptop, even when it was overclocked to 4.6 gigahertz, but it did get up to 91 degrees, so right at the thermal threshold. Now the display on this is excellent, 144 hertz, 100% sRGB coverage, and the display angles on this are actually also quite good. Now HID did upgrade this display with a minimal backlight bleed option, and there is very little backlight bleed on this display, which makes it great for gaming in low light environments. Opening this one-handed is not a problem because of the heavy base chassis. Now I was able to open the bottom of the laptop, and that gives you access to a number of things, all 3 M.2 slots, 2 memory slots, and a 2.5-inch hard drive slot, as well as your wireless card slot. In order order to get to those upgradable options, all you have to do is remove one screw, which makes it super simple to upgrade this machine. Now, I did see some images of the CPU heatsink and GPU heatsinks from online, and those did indicate there was 5 heatsinks for the GPU and 3 heatsinks for the CPU. I'm guessing this might be changed in the new model for 2019. Hard to say, but as you can see, the temps and everything on this machine are quite excellent. So whatever they've got in there for the heatsink setup, it's quite good. Now the keyboard on this thing is fantastic. It's got deep travel, a good overall feel. I wouldn't say it's the best keyboard I've tried. I did like the MSI GT75 keyboard more, but this is a very good all-around keyboard, and I really like the keyboard layout, especially with the arrow keys being set aside. It makes it very easy to find the arrow key. Now the touchpad worked flawlessly for me. You have very good control, and the touchpad buttons are dedicated and deep press, so if you like those, you'll really like this touchpad. I personally prefer it when the touchpad buttons are actually embedded into the touchpad myself, but overall this was a good touchpad. Now the speakers on this unit are excellent. They are not the loudest speakers I've ever heard on a laptop, but they are full sounding, both clear mids and highs, as well as a full-ish bass. Now one thing that was really interesting is that you have really good audio separation on the left and right side. I was actually able to tell directionally where things were coming from on the left or right side in Far Cry 5. Like if a car was coming from the left, I could tell it's on my left side, which normally doesn't happen with laptop speakers, so that's a big double thumbs up for me. The other big thing that this laptop has is that the fans actually are incredibly quiet overall, even when gaming, and because the speakers are loud enough, you can actually game with the speakers without the fans like droning out the actual gameplay, which it doesn't happen very often for very many gaming laptops, so that's a big thumbs up as well. As far as the fan noise sound, I would say it's a very low whoosh sound, not so much like a high whine like what you would get with a thinner gaming laptop. Now as far as battery life goes, don't expect much at all. You might be able to get an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 45 minutes if you optimize this as much as possible, but this has G-Sync. It's gonna eat your battery up so much because you have to run the RTX 2080 at all times, even when you're on battery power. Not recommended if you need a machine with battery power, but obviously this thing's huge. Okay, so overall I was really impressed with this machine. Great temperature, great performance overall, but the major downside here is that you're paying so much money for a laptop and you're still getting laptops from last year outperforming this one in certain key titles that I actually really care about. So I mean, if you care about PUBG, Fortnite, a lot of these CPU bound games like these battle royale games, a lot of them have huge maps, lots of players, very CPU taxing, and if you want to have really good performance in those games, you really have to have a 9900K or maybe a 8700K in a desktop CPU based laptop. So I think that's the biggest weakness of this machine, is it doesn't have a desktop processor. Sure, yes, the 8950HK is a high performer, and yes, you can overclock it with this machine, but even when you overclock it, you're not going to get the same performance as you would from a 9900K that comes stock with 8 cores at 4.7 gigahertz and can turbo boost up to 5 gigahertz on a single core. So I mean, this is a great laptop, but it's so hard to recommend if you're a person that wants to play those CPU bound games, and also if you want to render video and do CPU centric tasks, a 9900K laptop will perform better even if it ends up thermal throttling. And that's the counterpoint, right? A 9900K laptop will get very hot, where this one handled the temperatures even when overclocking the 8950HK. So if you want a machine that has excellent temperatures, that's quiet, has good speakers, it's a very well-rounded machine, get this one. This is a good option. It's not the one for me because I'm wanting one that has better performance, so I'm willing to push that temperature threshold a little bit more. I'm actually in the process of ordering an Alienware Area 51M that comes with a 9900K, and the great thing about the Alienware Area 51M is that it also has a thin bezel, so the overall footprint of the laptop is smaller. It's also quite a bit lighter, closer to 9 pounds, I believe, 9.5 pounds for the Area 51M. So overall, can I recommend this laptop? Yes, absolutely, just not for people that really want to have a high performance CPU, but overall this thing can really crank out the frame rates in like 95% of games, and I highly recommend taking a look at it, at least if you're in the market for a high-end gaming laptop. So that's it. That's my review of the Asus ROG G703GX. Fantastic overall laptop, definitely worth a look, and is a high quality laptop. I really hope that in the future though they make a 9900K version, or at least a desktop CPU version, because the performance of a desktop CPU is just, it's better. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Gizmo Slip Tech. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and slam that like button. We'll see you guys in the next one. Brandon out.